Hi everyone, we hope you had a good tea break. So we're starting panel 3 with an amazing lineup of speakers on stage over here. So just a gentle reminder again, as Antara mentioned, please submit all your burning questions to Slido as well as their microphones. So please feel free to ask a question on the floor as well. So without further ado, may I invite our first speaker, Dr. Duwan Lee, to give his presentation. Dr. Duwan, please.
So a little bit about what I do. I was with the US federal government for about 12 years as a professor, so I'm a recovering academic, but also as a principal scientist, which meant I did a lot of technical R&D projects with federal funding agencies, but mostly working on how malign actors may exploit the openness of the information environment to disrupt and coerce certain political processes in other countries. So that is sort of, my portfolio. I was able to transition to the tech industry about 6-7 years ago. I wasn't too happy with the former administration, so I resigned from my post from the Department of Defense. And I work in Silicon Valley building tools to support certain government programs, working on what we call FMI. So in Europe, we call it FIMI. In the States, now we have an official term. Odi and I came up with this official term about 2 years ago. Dr. Jake Shapiro from Princeton essentially pioneered this work. So now in the States, we call it FMI, Foreign Malign Influence. So my role at this point with the tech industry is essentially building tools, especially for certain commands, but we work very closely with Cyber Command. And the reason I start with that remark is that when it comes to information operations, something that we don't discuss enough is that there is this inherent disadvantage to democracies trying to compete against malign actors online. And there is, they are permitted to do all kinds of offensive and defensive activities online, but most democracies typically rely on defense for the most part, right? And the reason I talk about Cyber Command is that at least within the US context, Cyber Command is permitted and authorized to do both offensive and defensive operations in the information environment. So I want to share certain observations I've made in that regard. And I think a good way to summarize the gist of my talk would be whether the impact of AI in communications is underhyped or overhyped, right? To me, that's the prevailing theme, perhaps, of this venue. So I want to share some observations. And Dr. Bradshaw made some really incredibly powerful observations in regard. So let me give you some personal context in the same sort of regard. So earlier this year, we had perhaps one of the biggest cyber events back in the States. It's called RSA. I was on a panel with a guy named Chris Krebs. He was the former CISA director who ran all the security operations to safeguard our 2020 election. And we're talking about whether AI, generative AI, will have massive effects on our own election that took place about 2 weeks ago, right? And we were debating whether it'll have a major impact or not. I think I agree with Dr. Bradshaw that the general consensus is that we didn't see any measurable impact of generative AI on, our political process, for the most part, right? But there are, exceptions. For example, I think most people in this room should be familiar with what happened in Slovakia last September. So Michal Šimeska, the leader of Liberal Progressive Party, he was essentially interviewed by this newspaper called Dominic. And the audio file was about how Michal Šimeska was going to essentially fill envelopes with cash, right? And then push them out to the Roma community to buy votes because he thought that he was going to lose the elections quite badly. As you know, it was a fake audio. It turns out that it was built with an AI tool called 11 Labs. Anybody have used 11 Labs here? Very good. It costs $11 a month to use 11 Labs. By the way, how many of you have like TikTok accounts, like Instagram accounts here? I'm going to assume that at least 50% of you have those accounts. And I guarantee you, Benjamin, I can find your account, right? And I bet I can find at least 1 minute of your voice online that I can download, right? That's all I need to synthesize your voice and have that voice say whatever I want. Like, NATO started this war in Ukraine, right? And I can have you say that in up to 109 languages, right? And I'll show you some examples, very soon. Fast forward about, 5 months, 3 months. Bangladesh had general elections as well, earlier this year, January. If you come down to that picture, that's actually screenshots of a news clip that was uploaded to Facebook and TikTok, also YouTube. It was essentially a news clip criticizing U.S. foreign policy on Gaza, which was the same policy position championed by the incumbent Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, right? Again, really important case study to consider. All this synthetic content came out just a day or two before the polls opened, right? By the time the polls opened, the audio clip and the video clip, right, had been consumed millions of times, right? That alone is quite troubling, right? By the way, that synthetic deepfake news clip was generated with an AI tool called HeyGen. Anybody familiar with HeyGen here? Very good, right? It costs only $24 a month to use HeyGen, the full suite, right? Benjamin, do you think I can find 2 minutes of your video somewhere online? I bet I can, right? That's all I need. That's all I need to build your avatar, right? And I can have you say things, whatever I want, up to 125 languages, right? And I think, some of the pictures you see on this screen, we had this terrible hurricane called Helene not too long ago, and literally we saw a deluge of synthetic content, right? Mischaracterizing how the government is dealing with this natural disaster, right? And of course, the intent was to erode public trust in the federal government dealing with this natural disaster. And we were able to trace a lot of this content to, as you can guess, to Russia, right? So I think there is this ongoing debate, and that is it real? Is it overhyped? Is it underhyped? And to me, the way I would characterize 2024 is that it'll be remembered as the year of great AI experimentation, right? So they haven't had any measurable effects on public policies or public events. I think that's the consensus, right? But I think it's because we've seen a lot of experiments, not campaigns, right? So there's a huge difference between, right, episodic experiments and actual campaigns. It is true that we haven't seen AI-assisted misinformation, disinformation campaigns. I think that's true. But I think we've seen really interesting experiments in 2024. And I'll give you a very specific case study that we should all consider. It's called the Green Cicada Network. So this took place this year in Australia. I'll go over it very quickly, but it's a really important case study to consider because there were some really specific statistics that should be very alarming to us, right? Some of the tools that you can also use to create your own synthetic content. Every person you see over there, right, is synthetic. None of them is real. By the way, this is not always bad. I think there is a really important caveat to consider because just because something is synthetic doesn't mean it's bad, right? And just because something is organic doesn't mean it's safe or not harmful either, right? So I think there is this notion that, this assumption that oh my God, AI is going to doom us all, right? Because, even Europol thinks that by 2026, which is a little bit more 1 year out, right? 90% of all digital content will be synthetic, right? But I don't think all synthetic is all bad, right? But it does make detection and attribution much more challenging, right? So let me just show you a quick clip here just to give you a sense of where this technology is at this point. This is from a company called Flawless AI. It's an AI company in Hollywood. The CEO, Scott Mann, is a good friend of mine. He was also presenting at this event called RSA. So, it's not very long, but, it's worth, taking a quick look.
Now we're stuck on this stupid tower in the middle of nowhere. And I don't blame you, and now we're stuck on this stupid freaking tower in the middle of freaking nowhere. And it's all my fault.
軽蔑してるよね。仕方ないよ。Y es todo por mi culpa.
So, it's a short clip, but essentially, dubbing is almost as old as fiction, right? Or film, right? But essentially, this is real-time dubbing, right? And all the facial muscle movements actually match the words that you change or redact or remove or add up to 125 languages, right? I asked Scott, hey, aren't you afraid that this technology may fall in the wrong hands? And assuming that we can be friends and then keep things fairly discreet within this room, his answer was, not my problem. Now, it's a very typical response from entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, right? And I'm saying this as an American sort of technical person, so to speak, right? So I think this says a lot about what AI may do to the integrity of the information environment. I think this is, to me, I'm not here to give you a doomsday scenario, but it is also true that compared to social media, generative AI is much harder to regulate or put guardrails around, right? So I think there are certain indicators that are very troubling, and a lot of times I don't think we are essentially prepared to think about what it may do in the next couple of years. Oh, by the way, Scott was able to raise $250 million earlier this year as part of his Series B fundraising. Oh, 11 Labs, by the way, they did their Series B fundraising January this year. Can you guess how much they raised? $80 million, right? HeyGen just raised their A-series, A-round fundraising. I think they raised $60 million in July, right? Do you guys remember when GPT 3.5 came out? That was November 30th, 2022, less than 2 years ago. Can you guess how much money has gone into this Gen I industry since November 30th, 2022? Give me a good round number. $1 trillion US. So this is going to go faster and faster and faster, right? And this is a good chance to talk about the Green Cicada Network. And if you're wondering what Gen AI may do for mis and disinformation, another good case study that I really want to encourage you to consider is CounterCloud, right? Essentially, it's a fully automated mis and disinformation platform. It was a social experiment. You define a few key phrases and key topics. This platform will go out there, scrape content, right? Generate messages, tweets out of the scraped content, and push out to as many social media accounts you can link to the platform, right? So the Green Cicada Network is a good example of how powerful AI-assisted disinformation campaigns can be. And there's a really interesting story behind it as well. So it's about 5,000 fully synthetic accounts on X, right? Within the span of 3 months, it became number 3 in Australia as the most engaged account on X, right? The only reason we were able to detect this malicious network was that whenever you ask ChatGPT to generate something not very safe, we call it a safety trigger, right? And you're going to see something like this. As a large language model, I cannot produce what you're asking me to, right? We were able to detect this malicious network only because 5,000 X accounts were posting the same safety trigger concurrently, right? So they made a mistake, and that's the only reason we were able to detect this, right? But I think what's really shocking is that within 6 months, they were able to generate millions of followers and becoming number 3, the most engaged account on X in Australia, right? Now, so we did, there was a cybersecurity firm in Australia. They did some forensic analysis of this network. It turns out that it took one guy to build and run this network, right? It turns out that he was an AI researcher working at a research lab at Tsinghua University that has known ties to the PLA, right? Now he has his own AI company in Beijing. The thing is called Zipu AI. Oh, by the way, they just released their own large language model. So I think, the CCP has been using Australia as a testing ground for the past 20 years or so, right? So it is true that in terms of elections in Europe and in the States, we haven't seen real palpable measures of AI-assisted mis and disinformation. But in terms of what happened with the Green Cicada network, I think it is quite troubling. And I do think that 2025 will see not only experiments, but actual campaign assisted by this tool, because it's just so easy. And a lot of people ask me, hey, if Gen AI is going to be so popular and so pervasive everywhere, what jobs do you think will be lost to AI first, right? And there's a funny poetic justice in this question, and I think the trolls that used to work for Russia, they'll be out of job first, because now AI can take care of all the trolling the Kremlin needs, right? So I do think the threat, is real, right? And I think, we're seeing more and more of these threat indicators. Oh, by the way, there's certain, endeavors, in the States to put some guardrails around large language models or foundation models. So I'm pretty sure some of you are familiar with C2PA, right? Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, right? But also Google just announced Synth ID, essentially is a watermarking protocol for all synthetic content. So there are certain efforts to put certain guardrails around generative AI models. So it is true. At the same time, part of my job is scanning the dark web, and you'll be surprised how many unsanctioned models are being actively traded in the dark web at this point, right? I'll give you some examples because these are really powerful models. And of course, they're usually tuned or scraped from open source large language models, right? There are a lot of unsanctioned models being traded in the dark web that were essentially lifted from GPT 3.5 as well. So Worm GPT, right? Wolf GPT, Fraud GPT, Triple X GPT, PassScan, and so on and so forth, right? So I do think, we're at the cusp of seeing this, deluge of AI-assisted mis and disinformation. I think 2024 was perhaps the year of experimentation, but moving forward, I just don't think that we are properly equipped to deal with kind of AI-assisted disinformation. So what does that all mean? So let me just share some controversial observations. Because, we work with Cyber Command, we get to see certain threat actors or threat activities that are not, always available to the public, right? Number one, we're seeing this like rapid proliferation of AI-enabled dis and misinformation. Also, cyber like threats enabled by AI models. I think that's real. I think there's a real palpable sense of trepidation among cybersecurity professionals in this regard, right? What does that mean? I think relying on detection and analysis. That's our muscle memory for the past 20 years. Our muscle memory is really about, hey, let's detect as many disinformation campaigns as possible. What do we do when we do that? We just throw it on a nice sociogram, right? Network map and things like that. Having been in this space for like almost 15 years, both in the government and in the private sector, I just don't think that that tradecraft will work anymore, right? Because what we have to digest and analyze is so much, it is always overwhelming the human analyst, right? I just don't think that muscle memory will work anymore. The last point I want to share with you is that at least in my sort of community, working closely with the federal government and DoD, I think there is this growing awareness that defense is not enough, right? So this is what we call OD balance. I think there is this renewed conversation about how we can be more proactive with strategic communications, right? Because at the end of the day, what we are competing for is attention, right? You essentially occupy that bandwidth as much as you can. I think that's how we can win this battle, so to speak. And I think one thing that I want to leave you with is that remember that Gen AI can also be incredibly powerful to scale how we do strategic communications. In fact, there's a little vignette that I don't know whether you guys are tracking, but Ukraine has an AI spokesperson called Victoria, right? And I think these are the use cases, these are the solutions that we should consider, right? Because playing defense is going to be really futile in the age of generative AI, right? So let me just pause there, and then I'll be happy to take any questions later on.
Hello, everyone, and my name is Kokil Jedka. I'm an assistant professor at National University of Singapore, and I study, among other things, social media, online behavior, and language. And a lot of discussion in this event has been about misinformation and disinformation, and mainly about the intentionality of AI in creating problems, either in our democratic processes or in our behaviors, in our perceptions, and so on. I want to talk a little bit today and now about what happens when this is not intentional. In a lot of ways, the harms that we've talked about so far do seem a little far away, as long as we can tell ourselves that as long as we stay off social media, it's not going to hurt us. But there are some kinds of harms and some kinds of AI that we've taken for granted. And I just want to ask you all, how many of us have used ChatGPT or used any other LLM? Yeah, a lot of us. How many of you have used it to write that email you don't want to write? Yes. How many of you have used it to plan a holiday itinerary, perhaps? How many of you have used it to search for information you didn't know about? Increasing numbers of people go to the chatbots, go to these interfaces and ask about stuff they don't know about. And now search engines, in order to stay relevant, are going the extra mile and making these interfaces available to us within the search engines as well. So Google is forcing you to interact with and get answers from chatbots that you didn't ask for. I want to talk a little bit about this and what it means for user attitudes, especially when people are looking for news. Also note that we're in a very interesting context here. On the one hand, previous research before chatbots became a thing was already showing that there are local news deserts. I keep saying deserts. Local news deserts worldwide, which is large swaths of regions that have no local news representation. Right, the first tiny thumbnail, and I won't go too, I'll just skim through these. The point I'm trying to make is right from the UK to the European Union, to South America, and to the US, there are issues where the representation, even in the US, where these search engines are made, even in the US, when you search for news on Google or any other search engine, the news that's curated and presented to you is usually not representative. What you get is some kind of national news coverage, which tends to ignore the local aspects. And I'm gonna, of course, I lost where I was. But I'm gonna talk about why that's a problem. This has critical implications during times of crisis and especially elections, because you don't get the local news. Are you supposed to decide your local representative based on what's going on at the national level? Usually no. So it's not really a sign of a healthy democracy. This was the situation before chatbots came on the screen, on the scene. I want to talk a little bit about what has happened since in terms of the representation and diversity of the news and the information that we can get. Okay, so we all know one problem that exists, which is, of course, the search results and the answers we get from chatbots aren't updated. But beyond that, are there more concerns? To summarize the research gaps that I've talked about is, of course, the quality, the persuasiveness. So there's increasing research coming out that, of course, we find talking to chatbots a lot more convincing and a lot more persuasive. People tend to believe them and change their minds very often. But a lot of the research has focused on English, and we, Singapore as a multi-ethnic society, and other Southeast Asian countries which speak many languages, we don't know how well this is going to translate. So we did 2 studies. Now here's the place where a multi-method and a hybrid approach comes in handy. The computer scientists are just going to count up the numbers and tell you whether something is representative or diverse or not. But that gives us very little insight into what people in this room care about, which is how people are thinking, how people are going to behave, how they are perceiving, and whether it's interfering with the health of a democracy. So the first study looked at the numbers and just looked at when you query these systems, what is the quality of the outputs you get. Please excuse me for the next slide. It's a bit, it looks like this. This is how we collected the data. I just want to show you how we queried the system, and in a lot of cases, we were not getting any answers for countries in Southeast Asia. So we asked Google News or we asked ChatGPT, what are the policies and achievements of, for instance, the People's Action Party? This is the People's Action Party. This is not any other party. On key issues for the Singapore election 2025, the number of results is 0. We ask it again. This time we remove 2025, and we are still hoping for some answers. This time we get 1 result, but it's about Warren Buffett, so that's not relevant. You see a big problem here, that in the world's imagination, in the internet's imagination, Singapore is just a little red dot. What this meant was that of the queries we asked ChatGPT and Google News, only 2 out of 23 returned relevant answers from Google News and 0 out of 23 from ChatGPT. If we turn to a system that is relying completely on chatbots, are we in danger of letting Singapore be forgotten? If we talk about diversity, the 1 or the 2 relevant queries returned 120 news outlets, of which 1 was returned for ChatGPT. We're working on further analysis to see how many of these were actually newspapers based in Singapore, but I don't have high hopes. Don't hold your breath. In Indonesia, for instance, you'll see that the numbers here are bigger because we also wanted to look at regions, and there are more parties. So there are 11 parties, according to Wikipedia, and there are 9 regions. And when we look at those numbers, we see that the relevance increases a little bit. So there are 66 out of 184 responses which are actually relevant to what we asked, but the number is half of that when you talk to ChatGPT. Again, the world's perception or ChatGPT's perception, even after knowing the whole world's knowledge, seems to be really limited. In terms of diversity, thousands of resources, thousands of outlets are returned. Whether this is sufficient or not depends on what the local coverage is, and this is an ongoing project. We just finished, we're still collecting data as we speak. The numbers for US you would think would be better, but I don't know how you feel about these. Once again, the number of results returned that are relevant to questions asked about US parties in different states, it's really, really low. It's actually better with ChatGPT. Interesting. And in terms of representativeness, yes, there are more that can specifically answer to a party. So what we're seeing here is that even in the best case scenario, the numbers are pretty paltry in terms of their representation, their diversity, and their relevance to understanding news. Even though news information seeking is now increasingly a big part of 2024, given that it's the year where most of the world is going into elections. So those are the numbers, and the numbers suggest a very sad state of affairs. I'm sure you'll agree with me that relying on chatbots for the news isn't great. But are people going to know the difference, and is it going to matter to people? So this was the second part of our study, where we did a survey experiment, and we wanted to see that, okay, part of the problem is the quality, but what about the modality? So if I give you the same results from Google, but with a chatbot, are you happier? Is the difference only the modality? So the research questions you see here are users more persuaded by news content generated by GPT-enabled search as compared to traditional search? How does it differ? How does their attitude and behavior differ? And what affects their perception and engagement? So this is from a real chat that happened where we first asked people a bunch of questions, and then we said, okay, we assigned them to different conditions. And in the chatbot condition, they could have a chat with a chatbot and ask questions about the questions we had asked them earlier. It's basically a knowledge test. And in the middle, this is like a way for them to improve their knowledge. So what you see here is a real participant who is asking the chatbot about one question that they think they got wrong. And then the chatbot is correcting it. I made a small clip, but of course, the whole conversation was much longer. Okay, great. I have lost my spot again. Give me a second. So what we saw was that the average length of conversations was about 10 turns and 71 characters, which means people were asking and sending at least 71 characters. And this was the English cohort. You see two things bolded because there were two chatbot conditions, one using data from Google and one from chatbots, generated from chatbots by searching whatever data they had, again, to establish whether the difference was just the interface or the quality as well. We did something similar in Spain as well. I'm not going to zoom into this just in case I break something. Similar setup. Spanish speakers in the US were more articulate, so they were writing longer messages. There were shorter chats overall, but longer messages. And and other than that, yeah, the numbers looked pretty similar. So the first big finding is, do they perceive a difference in the information quality? So prior research corroborates this, that chatbots are considered or perceived to be less biased. They are perceived to be about the same credible. This was just marginally significant. They are perceived to be more relevant, even though I showed you that in the numbers that's really not the case. They're perceived to be more understandable, and people do end up spending more time on these chatbot-based interfaces to get information as compared to just a list of Google results that's provided to you. That's the dashed line you see here. Right? So it's gaining more engagement, and it's perceived as more understandable, at least in English, not so much in Spanish. So what we're seeing here is that despite the questionable difference in quality, to people, they actually prefer the chatbot version. So this is overall chatbot version. Let's look a little bit more deeper into the different treatments themselves. Is it changing people's confidence, and so on? So what you see here are the results for English, the results for the experiment with English. What you see here is that interacting with chatbot is improving their knowledge. Great. It's making them perceive something as more important because they spend time talking to a chatbot about it. Great. But for Spanish speakers, it is reducing their ability to detect misinformation. So what you see here is for the Spanish speakers who engaged with this chatbot, They are no longer able to figure out what's true and what's false. They're doing worse at a misinformation quiz as compared to before. And that is a real problem. Not only is the data less representative towards other languages, but it's also actively harmful, right? So what we're hoping to show with this experiment and this project, which we are still very much in the process of running, is all of these insights about information behavior and how the very fundamental way in which chatbots are changing the way we get information has huge implications for information quality, because we perceive this to be more credible and less biased, even though we can no longer see where this is coming from. We perceive these things to be more important, even though, once again, we get the same information in different ways. In terms of knowledge gain, it appears to improve our knowledge, but only for English. So think about all the languages we all speak and what the consequences could be over there. And think about the people who interact with these chatbots in their local languages. The feedback we got from the participants was, it was so lovely to talk with a Spanish chatbot, because this is not something that they get access to regularly, right? So we trained our chatbot to talk in Spanish and discuss politics with Spanish in them. And they were so blown away by the novelty of the experience that it ruined their accuracy in judgments. So think about how interacting with chatbots matters, especially in non-English communities. Implications, of course, going back to the context I was setting. This is reducing the lens with which we see the world, down to a few outlets that are global, that are English-speaking. In fact, the representation of news for Spanish was so low that we had to do an extra hack and translate the English news results so that we would have a comparative study. That's how bad it is. Do we want a monolithic world that speaks only English? User perceptions. So users' inability to audit the backend, leading them to trust chatbot-powered answers as more credible and less biased. This may be because of confirmation bias, and we are currently examining the chat transcripts. As you know, and as people here would have said, confirmation bias is that if you ask the chatbot, I think this party sucks, I think they did a terrible job at the last election, and I think they deserve to fail, then the chatbot may respond in kind. We're going to check this out, but it may leave you with your beliefs entrenched, which is harder to do when you have a list of news results in front of you and you have to make sense of them on your own. Right, and journalism. Newer financial models that further integrate AI in reporting and curating news throw further questions on the credibility of an LLM-powered news pipeline, creating a lot of other questions. We have a few recommendations. These are audits done by one professor and one undergraduate in one university in Singapore. There need to be more transparent multilingual evaluations to ensure equitable access to credible information. There need to be more exploration across contexts to see how LLM-powered search could improve its information quality. Currently, it's pretty terrible. There needs to be more oversight, because not enough people seem to think about intentionality, seem to think about AI-powered search as a problem. We've talked too much about other more attractive and appealing and scary problems, but the information that we are feeding each other and ourselves every day is problematic as well. And there need to be more interventions. There need to be interventions to ensure that people understand what they're consuming. Is AI generated even if the intentionality, or AI curated even if the intentionality may not be at fault? Right, thank you so much. That was my presentation. There are references on this slide if you want to take a picture, and also the study design, which is at the OSF. Thank you very much for your attention.
Last but not least, we have our last speaker, Dr. Priyanka Bala. Dr. Priyanka, the floor is yours.
My name's Dr. Priyanka Bhalla, and I'm here with you today from Meta. I actually work on safety policy. I was initially going to just sit over there and have a more chilled out conversation with you, but then my esteemed panel colleagues both came to the podium, so I'm speaking to you from the podium right now. Before I actually get into how we look at misinformation specifically at Meta, I just wanted to call out a couple of different things. One is that I thought it was very interesting what Duan said about this being the year of experimentation when it's come to Gen AI in particular, and how this has actually impacted the way we've looked at elections. I think it's also interesting because we've had 40 elections that have taken place this year and about 4 billion people who have gone out to vote, right? And how there's basically consensus that this year, even though it was a year of experimentation, it's not had a large impact per se in terms of how we're looking at AI-assisted campaigns or disinformation in general. I thought it was also very interesting what you said about how regulation is not necessarily the answer when it comes to setting guardrails. It might work when it comes to social media platforms, but as we know, there's so many other different types of methods that are being used. You mentioned the dark web, for example. So I thought that was very interesting. And then, you know, Dr. Kokil, what you said about having more diversity and representation and the inclusion of languages when it comes to our training models and open source training models in particular, I think is also a very, very good sort of key takeaway point. In terms of what I'm actually going to talk to you about today is three things. So first, I'm going to talk about how generally we look at preventing and responding to misinformation in particular from an industry perspective. And some of you who've attended the Drums conference before might have seen this already in the past from my colleague Alice, who heads up misinformation policy at Meta. The reason I'm going to talk about this again is because it really explains how our overall approach when it comes to synthetic media has evolved. So whether it's generative AI, whether it's deep fakes, whether it's cheap fakes, right? Or whether it's so-called manipulated media, which also includes voice recordings, it really explains how our overall approach has evolved in that particular scenario. And then I'm just going to comment a little bit on how this has specifically impacted our approach to elections integrity and how we have looked at it within that context specifically. And comment a little bit about how, you know, there's been a lot of talk about how Gen AI and what it can do is a great challenge, but it also offers great opportunities and great benefits, right? And you mentioned strategic communication, for example, but it can also have great benefits in other areas, such as reaching audiences that you might not be able to reach otherwise, and also in the context of media literacy, which, you know, Ben has talked about a lot today as well. But just being super clear here, and I know that pretty much everyone in the audience knows this difference, right? But I think it kind of underpins our overall approach. So, and why I'll be talking more about misinformation versus disinformation, right? In terms of the actual differences for misinformation, right, what we see is that it's something that's shared unintentionally. You know, something that appears much more within our content. And I'll talk a little bit more about what our actual three-part strategy is in trying to address misinformation in different contexts. Whereas disinformation, as we all know, is something that has malicious intent, that's much more deliberate, that, you know, is what Duan described as the cicada network. We have many different strategic network takedowns at Meta, both on Facebook and on Instagram, and every quarter we come out with a threat intel report, which actually tells you what are the different networks that we've taken down, whether they have to do with foreign influence or other types of strategic operations. When it comes to misinformation, I think a lot of times when people, you know, talk about social media companies and, you know, what are the different rules that you use when it comes to content, a lot of times they'll think of it within the context of, oh, you either leave the content up or you remove it. But actually we have a lot of different levers available to us, and this is very true when it comes to misinformation in particular. So for misinformation in particular, there's three main levers that we use. The first is to remove the content, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail. The second is to actually reduce the distribution and the virality of the content. And then the third is to actually inform. So informing the user of the action that we're actually taking and how we're doing that, and working with external fact checkers to help us with this as well. Because we do believe that media literacy is incredibly important, and that's where we then use our inform lever in particular. So when it comes to removal, a lot of times we get the question, well, why don't you just remove all misinformation? You know that it's misinformation, and why don't you just do that? Well, first of all, we can't do that because we're an American company. We are not the arbiter of all truth, right? I think it's very important to remember that. Second, there's different degrees and perceptions about what is actually true and what is false, and we should not be the main decision maker when it comes to content like that. Also, as I mentioned with misinformation in particular, a lot of times it's information that's shared unintentionally, right? Like, I think you mentioned your grandmother sharing something unintentionally. I have family members and friends who've many times done that. And so we don't want to unfairly penalize a person for something they've done once or twice unknowingly, right? We think that that's really unfair as well. I also just want to point out that when it comes to removal, it's based on our community standards. So these are the rules for Facebook and Instagram that guide us on what do we actually make sure stays on the platform and what comes off. I think what's super important to remember is that these rules that we have are, number one, global in nature. Secondly, it's a really tough balance for us because we're trying to ensure that there's both freedom of expression in people's voices, but also safety and respectful behavior online. And third, we understand that there's a lot of cultural context and nuance that's very important to take into consideration when it comes to these actual rules. In the context of elections in particular, and having worked on a lot of high-risk elections myself this year, whether it was Pakistan, whether it was Bangladesh, whether it was India, whether it was Indonesia, so being very sort of APAC specific right now, a lot of the sort of misinformation examples that we might have taken on or taken off according to our community standards have to do with misinformation that we know is going to lead to violent and imminent harm, for example, or specific types of misinformation that are trying to really target voter suppression in particular. So what do I mean by reduce? Okay, so when it comes to reducing, our second lever, I'm specifically talking about trying to reduce the actual distribution and virality of false or altered stories. This could also be trying to reduce the actual distribution of pages or domains that we know repeatedly share false news. So Dimple, the example that you were giving with your research, you had this whole list of sites where it's really abundantly clear that they keep on sharing false news. So we do have this pre-existing knowledge and we're able to reduce the virality of those. Third is also distribution of spammy or sensational content. A lot of times we may see this in links that can lead to frauds and scams. This could be celeb bait as well, for example. So all of this would fall under the category of actually reducing that type of content. And we don't do this alone, right? Because again, we are not the main decision maker when it comes to what is meant to be truth or what is meant to be labeled as misinformation. We actually have a global network of fact checkers. So we have 100 fact checkers worldwide. They cover 60 different languages, and within APAC, it covers 37 different countries. And these are all certified by the International Network for Fact Checking. And here you'll see some names that you're very much so familiar with already. So what do we do when we actually inform? Right? What are the different labels that we might put on content, and how do our fact checkers actually help us to do this? Here are some specific examples. So our fact checkers will put something called a fact check label, which actually tells you that content has been altered or might have been altered, and you might not want to share it forward. What we also share sometimes with users is if there's been certain penalties that this account or this information has gotten in the past when it comes to putting certain strikes, for example. And if it's been a repeat offender, then we give a notification on that as well. Also, in terms of transparency, so the Transparency Center is incredibly important. Not only will you find more granular information on the community standards here that I've talked about, but for misinformation in particular, if you want to know more about what are the actual penalties that we apply when it comes to Facebook and Instagram and specific types of content, we've actually given an explanation here on what those penalties are. So I'm now going to take this and transition a little bit into how this is applying into synthetic media and Gen AI specifically, and how we're trying to use transparency and responsibility there in an evolutionary way. So when it comes to AI and misinformation, I think both my panel colleagues talked a lot about it already, but with the elections this year, one of the biggest concerns that we had both internally but also externally was people saying, oh my God, there's going to be all these deep fakes. What are you going to do about it, right? But actually, that wasn't really the case. There were not so many deep fakes that we were completely overwhelmed by it. Secondly, we made a lot of progress when it came to giving disclosures and doing labeling and transparency when it comes to actual AI-generated content. So we're working very closely with industry peers on this as well. I know C2PA was mentioned, of course, and there's many different companies who are participating in this, such as OpenAI and Microsoft as well. And together, we're able to actually detect different types of content when it comes to both placing visible and invisible watermarks on that actual content. So let me just show you an example of that. When it comes to Meta's apps, and in Singapore you'll find Meta AI and Imagine in particular, that is already widely available. Anytime there's AI-generated content that's there, you will see an actual visible watermark that says over here, imagined with AI. So now you might be asking, okay, but what if it's not a Meta product? What if it's other developers who are trying to use your LLM model, for example, and they're trying to put different types of content there, which is not part of our actual AI products. So what we're trying to do with third-party AI-generated content is, again, using pre-existing tools, either by C2PA or also by IPTC, which has a guidebook on actually using different standards of how to be more transparent and label Gen AI content. So we're using those standards in particular, and we're encouraging developers to do that as well, particularly when it comes to imagery. But when we're talking about audio, for example, or even video, in that case, at the moment, because this technology keeps on evolving, we're actually asking them to self-disclose and to label content when it does end up being, photorealistic video that's digitally created, or audio that's very realistic sounding. Another point which is interesting in the context of elections is that when it comes to ads in particular that have been digitally created or altered in a political context, this is where we also want them to disclose if it's something that is AI generated. And what are some specific examples of when this might actually happen? So they would have to label if it's depicting a real person, that's saying or doing something that they actually did not say or do, depicting a realistic-looking person that does not exist, or a realistic-looking event that did not happen, or if they're actually altering footage of a real event, right? So this is one particular part that we take very, very seriously, and we have taken down content in elections this past year when this has actually not matched what we are trying to propose with this particular policy. I also just wanted to say that one example of where generated AI was used, you could arguably say in a positive manner, was during the Pakistan elections, for example, where we had a video of Imran Khan speaking, because he was in jail, he was under arrest, right? And so how was he actually supposed to reach different audiences during campaign time? And all those videos were labeled, and it was fully disclosed that they were AI generated, but it was just yet another way of communication for him to be able to reach audiences during that election time. Also, just wanted to highlight, I mentioned this during the beginning of my presentation, but transparency itself and labeling that something is AI generated, as we all know, is really just part of the solution. I think there's many other things that we can do, are already doing, or could potentially implement when it comes to being better at preventing and responding to risks that might emerge in this area. I think for Meta, of course, as I've already explained, our community standards do apply to this content, and it doesn't matter whether it's synthetic or non-synthetic, like those same community standards apply. As I mentioned, AI-generated content is equally fact-checked like non-AI-generated content. And that's why I mentioned to you our overall approach to misinformation first before talking about how we actually deal with AI-generated content. And I think another point that I just want to drive home is that all of this technology is evolving. So we do have some good standards out there, such as C2PA, for example, but this space really keeps on evolving. And I think especially when it comes to video and to audio in particular, there's still certain strides that we need to make. Again, I think as you mentioned, this was the great year of experimentation, and hopefully certain parts of that can be strengthened as we move along. I wanted to super quickly just show you some of the different collaborations that we have that might be interesting for folks in the room. Besides, our overall approach being collaborative, we do have a community forum on AI that we hold globally in different regions where we bring together different stakeholders and speak to them about different issue areas, especially when it comes to safety, for example, and Gen AI in particular. We also have an open innovation AI research community, so if anyone is interested in that, I can send more information. I'm actually going to skip over the open loop program, but I did want to mention that because there were so many elections this year and because there was sort of unanimous concern over deceptive AI that could be used, we also signed on to the AI Elections Accord alongside many different other companies who were trying to address this issue. So thank you so much. That's it for me, and looking forward to having a deeper discussion.
Thank you, Priyanka.